none of these systems are magic. They've been
Yeah.
put into place by
Yeah.
human beings. They can, it's hard, don't get me wrong, but they can be undone by human beings. And maybe that is an unfortunate silver lining of this administration, is that so much is being disrupted and dismantled. And maybe, quite frankly, some of it needs to be. Hello, and welcome to In the Meanwhile. I'm Marcus Harrison Green.
And I'm Nora Kenworthy. And today I want to start by asking you, Marcus, I really want to know what your weird pandemic hobby was during COVID. Maybe artisanal baking or digital stealth murder schemes on Among Us.
You know, it was parts tragic and awesome. I became a John Mayer fan during that time. And
He's hard not to love.
Hard and easy, right? I mean, there's some people who detest him. I've learned the hard way. But yes, I went through the entire catalog, even when he was, dating both Taylor Swift and Katy Perry, before she went up in the rocket, of course, when she was, semi-cool. And it has opened up so many doors in my life, I must say.
I love that for you.
All those doors closed right behind me too, but that was mine. What about yours, Nora? What about yours?
When the pandemic started, I was raising a 3-year-old, so it was just literally like, what can we do to get until nap time?
Yes.
And my husband and I started rebranding like very basic life things as fun games that could last as long as humanly possible. And one that kind of stuck with us was this game that we literally called Sink or Float, which literally just means going to the local waterway and dropping natural things into the water to see if they sink or float, and placing bets.
Oh, wow.
Like whether sticks are going to sink or float. But my daughter still thinks of that game as very fun.
I'm glad somebody does.
It convinced me that part of parenting is just branding.
Yes.
It's just selling to your kid what you need to do on an everyday basis to survive as fun and enjoyable.
Are there social gatherings around this game now? Did this survive those times?
It definitely still happens when we're outdoors. No
tariffs on those. So,
yeah, exactly.
Anyhow.
So the reason we're chatting about this is, it's probably obvious to listeners, but we're commemorating a lot of 5-year anniversaries right now.
Yes. It was a confluence of hell 5 years ago, many people say, right? You had COVID, the height of the pandemic. There was George Floyd as well. Here in Seattle, we had Chaz, what was then known as Chop. There are people who still believe that Seattle is overrun Mad Max style with nothing but demon spawn and I don't know, just maniacs wielding axes and knives and so forth. But rest assured, we are okay. We're all right, and life remains on. So anyhow, my goodness, yes, it is. It's hard. I was talking to a journalist friend about this the other day, and even though it's been 5 years, it's that time has never really gone away in terms of it's the weight of it is still sort of with us, even though it was so long ago, and it's not as if we haven't grown or our time is obviously passed, but it's
you're not a John Mayer fan anymore.
Not the love is still there, yes. But it's still so present, to a point of my God, it's been so formative, obviously with young people, but certainly, I should say younger people. I'm only 44, but anyway, but it's just still so very, very present, and I don't know, it's almost as if many people are still trying to process the whole situation.
Yes, still processing. It's so present, and also I feel like the number of times that we've tried to declare these various things over
right.
or done with is starting to get comical, right? And so I think when you and I were talking about the sort of genesis of this podcast, a lot of it was coming out of this feeling of like, we're still living in it. We're still in the meanwhile of this thing. And, for example, with COVID, something that started that we all thought was going to last for a couple of weeks is still happening. And we're still living in this very weird time of rupture, and figuring out how we do that.
Yeah, and I mean, and seeing, some of the, just looking at the research where you have Pew polls that say I think it's 72% of people in the United States that, talk about, COVID has either if impacted their life either in a major or minor way.
Yeah.
It seems like divisions along class, along race, along ideology, along along generations, right, are, continue to be widened, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like we're just, COVID shook up the society.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it shook up the world too, right? But I mean, it certainly shook up our society. And it seems like we're just continuing to try to reconfigure and configure, in a way that makes sense for people. And I mean, because right now it still doesn't make any sense. Like right now does not make any sense, at least to me. And then I know a lot of other people it doesn't.
Yeah. And how much do you think like the both rupture and the backlash that happened after the rupture and I'm speaking here of both COVID, but also the racial justice protests of 2020.
Right.
I mean, how much of that really impacts our everyday politics right now? Because it feels like so much is just a reactionary politics to that time.
Right. The extreme backlash, as they say. I mean, I'll say, right. I mean, I think even during that time period, right, post George Floyd, and I was somebody who I had stopped going to protests, prior to 2020, because it seemed like we'd go to protests and then nothing would really change. There'd be another death by, police would kill somebody else, and then we'd be at it again. And it's like, to me, it was the definition of insanity, right? Doing the same thing over and over and over again, and without any new result. And so, but I remember in 2020, there was this huge, massive protest at Othello Park in South Seattle, and there weren't any police there. The organizer had asked, no police to be there. These were like maybe...
I remember that march. It was amazing.
Like 20,000 or some odd people. It was huge. Like I remember...
It was so peaceful too.
Yeah, extremely peaceful. I remember, I think it was ABC News had reached out to me because I had taken a photo. They reached out to me to use it for their morning show the next day. And you just had this feeling of like, okay, maybe we hit like a watershed moment in society. Yeah. Maybe, you had people from Mitt Romney, Republican senator and Republican presidential candidate, I want to say, in 2012, as well as Nikki Haley, who were marching in the street, literally marching in the streets for Black Lives Matter, right? And I thought like, okay, maybe like this is the grand reset, right? Maybe this is the time that we actually, move things forward and there's a shift. And then it was, I don't know, you fast forward to today and it's like, oh yeah, no, I was, back to our regularly scheduled sexism and racism right now.
Except worse.
Yes, that's right. We got the enhanced pack of racism and
it all seems bound together in this sort of like almost like FU politics of the moment that I really do think is doubling back, right, on where we were when kind of 2020 started.
Right. I was talking to another friend and, and we were talking about how there's always been backlash, right, to progress in our society, whether it's women's suffrage, right, whether it's the civil rights movement, with, Reconstruction and so forth. But there seems like in those cases, there's not a complete rollback, right? Like there's always some vestiges that are left. Whereas in this case, right, we have the federal government has pulled out of consent decrees and essentially oversight of police departments that have a history of, racial bias in their policing. Even in Minneapolis, right, where, George Floyd was killed by Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. You have, obviously this retrenchment when it comes to things like DEI and the workforce and as well as the federal government. And so I continue to wonder, there seems to just be this grand project to scrub our society of any type of vestige of 2020, right? I mean, it isn't just the fact that, you know, this is a quote unquote correction to what was in some people's minds, right, an overcorrection when it came to racial justice and so forth. But it's like, no, this is, we want to go absolutely back in the opposite direction,
Yeah.
you know, to the point where we keep going in that direction.
Yeah. I don't want to be too Pollyanna about this because it's like really, really bad right now. But I'm also wondering, like, I think that's a project, but I'm not sure if the project is succeeding in the minds of people, right? Like, I don't know. Do you feel like there are certain mindsets that actually did shift during that time, or was it just purely performative?
I mean, I think even at the time, right, people were calling out some of the performative nature of it, right, where you had...
Oh, some of it was like grossly.
Yeah, I mean...
like Nancy Pelosi and the Kente Club.
Right. God, yeah, jeez. I forgot. I almost forgot that image.
I'm
It's
sorry.
very vivid now. But yeah, I mean, everything from people, right, putting up black squares on their Instagram to, you know, just folks who were, you know, you had these corporations who were throwing up all of their pronouncements and so forth, even though they were, you know, paying black people less than than what, you know, on average than their white counterparts. I mean, even in that moment, I'll say, like, I mean, it's just the cynicism. Maybe, I don't know. It was maybe the cynicism in me at that moment where it's like, okay, yeah, sure, this is great, but capitalism is still going to win.
Yes.
There's still, you know, we're still very much a country that is steeped in white supremacy, you know, patriarchy and so forth. And eventually it's going to rue the day, right? I mean, it's going to end. Here we are, right? And so, I mean, to your point, right? I mean, I think, well, I do think it shifted some minds. In some ways, I think it also, I don't know, just sort of cemented and solidified certain bias thinking already and certain tribalism, if you will, when it came to I don't know, when it came to things like race, right? Because I think that particularly during that time period, right, with COVID, so many of us were isolated, so many of us felt, you know, loneliness, and I think a unintentional, I shouldn't say intentional, but I'll say a consequence of that is that I think it made people sort of attach themselves to various beliefs that they might not have entertained before, right? I mean, you had the rise of QAnon at that time period, which, you know, for refreshers, you know, folks who were sort of right-wing conspiracy theorists around so many different things that were absurd. You know, some of them took place, or some of them participated in January 6th, which I guess doesn't exist these days, or nobody seems to care about anymore. Yeah. And so I do think, right, that in many ways you had these people it almost like put gasoline on the polarization that was already happening, because people were in desperate need and desperate search of anything that, you know, would provide belonging to them, right? I mean, you know, there's a lot of people who study extremism, and they always talk about the main reason that folks, you know, join things like, you know, KKK or, you know, other white supremacist groups and so forth, is the fact that they're seeking belonging. And right, and that's kind of how they get them. Like, they start with, oh, hey, man, you see some disaffected youth or some alienated young person, and you talk to them, you know, in a way that they haven't been spoken to, in the terms of like they feel listened to, they feel gotten, so to speak. And then you hit them over the head with, oh yeah, by the way. So yeah. Anyhow, I know that was a long roundabout way to your question there, but this is we're living in the meanwhile. So here we go.
We are on the very roundabout path that we're on right now. But I know I appreciate what you're saying about both the way this really bizarre meantime of the pandemic, right? Impacted people, but also the ways that we have continued to respond to things that are happening in our midst with further polarization on both sides, right? And a real kind of what scientists call affective polarization, which means essentially we respond not just by polarizing ourselves along political lines, but actually polarizing ourselves along the lines of feeling,
Yes,
right?
yes.
And relation. And we tend to perceive people on the other side as much further away from us than they already are, as much less human, right? And this happens on both sides.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I've seen that even within close community groups, like within families. I'll say,
Yeah.
like, I remember during the height of the pandemic, excuse me, um, I remember I was reporting on a family, and you had a mother in the family. I think she was in her 60s, I want to say, and her son, who was in his 40s and had 3 children, like was not allowing her to see her grandkids, because he kept calling her stupid and saying how dare she sort of believe that the COVID was real and that and the pandemic, and the fact that she was going to vote for Joe Biden, that it was like he kind of viewed that as like almost like being a part of a satanic cult.
Yeah, like you're dead to me, or you're
Right,
out.
exactly.
Right?
And they would literally be at the same park together, right?
Oh my
And like
God.
he wouldn't make eye contact with her, but he would text her and he would be like, "Are you still being stupid right now?" And 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 gonna vote for Joe Biden. Why are you being foolish? You'll never see your grandkids. Like holding them hostage, essentially,
Oh my
for
God.
her. I don't even want to say beliefs, right? It was mainly just her actions, right? At that
Yeah.
time, right? I mean, I never got the opportunity to follow up with her. We kind of just sort of fell out of touch. But the fact that that was going on in a small town
Yeah.
in a family that lived maybe 2 miles away from each other.
Yeah.
And it's like, how do you square that circle, right? And I just remember sort of the desperation in her voice of like, she was like, I love my son, I love my grandkids, but I might have to let them go because I can't continue to put myself through this abuse.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I mean, and I think, hopefully it wasn't to that extremity for, for a variety of people in our, for the mass amount of people, I should say, in our society. But I mean, I think there was some of that for all of us, right?
Yeah. I mean, not to that extent, but I think all of us know someone who's been quote unquote lost to QAnon, right? Or someone who's been just totally swept up in, really anti-vaccine or anti kind of COVID science beliefs. And I think part of the challenge is that it's not just that, okay, this person sitting in my living room has a completely different set of beliefs than me, but at a certain point, those beliefs became, dangerous, right?
Right.
And the grounds of justification for severing relationships and not doing the work of repair that we were really talking about last time.
To your point, like, I wonder how much bridge building, right, can even be done right now for some people, right?
Yeah.
And I know, a friend of mine, Ben McBride, I think he would, be okay if I called him sort of a civil rights leader, but he takes people down to Montgomery, Alabama, I think twice a year to do sort of this civil rights tour of Montgomery. And and his whole thing is like, how do we build bridges in a society where we have two different versions of reality, right? Or at the very least, two different operating systems on us, right? in our beliefs and how we show up. And the fact that it can't just, sometimes like, people are like, this is, I wish we could live in harmony. And he's kind of like, can't we just live, Can't we just coexist?
Yeah.
And that is sort of the thing that I'm sort of maybe settled on at this, or resigned to, is like, can't we just coexist at times, right? Where It just seems that there, to your point earlier about, this hyperpolarization happening on both sides, there's a point where I worry, like, when does it get to the point, and we see it now, right, with a lot of the, I guess you could call it political violence. I just call it the straight up violence that is happening, where you have people being attacked, um, vigilante style for their beliefs. And look, I understand there is a heaping, a ton of context with some of the things that have happened, whether it's the situation in Boulder, Colorado,
Yeah.
the situation with the United Healthcare CEO, and so on and so forth. That being said, though, if we get to a point where violence seems to not even just be a last resort, but a resort that people elect freely without any type of strategy of other than like causing pain, what does that do for us, right? Like, what are we sort of communicating to each other, right? In terms of like our commonality, if you will.
Yeah. Let alone the generations that come behind us, right? For whom that becomes more normal, right? Or becomes part of the historical record, right? I worry about, what some people call the kind of Overton window of like what's seen as acceptable in society. And, I think we've seen that very much radically shift over the last, decade or so, to the point where things that would have been completely unacceptable to say or do in public 5-10 years ago are now not just seen as acceptable by one side, but are held up and celebrated, right? Like, for example, the June 6th or January 6th, June. We're in June now. Okay. But I also wonder, like, why this really, at times, even violent resistance to moving forward, right? In some way, and this kind of very aggressive sort of almost kind of folding back towards the past of like, no, we aggressively want something that used to exist and to reject this forward movement. I don't know if you read this piece when it circulated in 2020, but Arundhati Roy, one of my favorite authors and political advocacy folks, wrote this piece in the Financial Times as one of the kind of early COVID peaks was hitting, and talked about the sense of kind of rupture and possibility of that moment. And she wrote, the rupture exists, and in the mind of this terrible despair, it offers us a chance to rethink the doomsday machine we have built for ourselves. Nothing could be worse than a return to normality. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little baggage, ready to imagine another world, ready to fight for it. And like, we chose option A, and we dragged all our dirty laundry through the door with us. And like, why?
Yeah, I mean, that is an excellent question, right? I mean, I think back, right, I think back to that day in the park in Othello a lot, like that I mentioned earlier, right, where you had tens of thousands of people, again, peacefully gathering, peacefully, not even demonstrating, but it was almost like a sort of collective ritual they all engaged in of just like recognition that things weren't right in our society, right? And they did so peacefully. Like, you saw people getting together, you saw them like alongside each other, like you saw just exchange of ideas and thoughts, and like people really listening to each other, like truly listening to each other, right? And then, to your point, we fast forward 5 years, and it's like I couldn't imagine something like that happening right now, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we've had. I mean, that being said, right? Last year was one of the deadliest years on record for police police killing civilians, right?
Yeah.
And I have I haven't seen 500,000 people get out in the streets again. It's almost as if folks are either exhausted or resigned or cynical or maybe all three are just apathetic, right? Or maybe also just trying to survive, right?
Yeah.
When we saw, I'll say like 5 years, and I think at the height of the pandemic, when folks were truly coming together, and there are all these like sort of mutual aid networks that were popping up sort of ad hoc and spontaneously, it was truly sort of this, we're in this together. And I think now after these 5 years, whether it's been, for a variety of factors, I'm sure income inequality, I'm sure, the fact that we've had, continue to have sort of 5 years of erosion civically and so forth in our society is a contributing factor. But the fact that I think most people, or at least the plurality, certainly have arrived at the conclusion that we're in this alone, and so I'm going to get mine, and I'm going to try to survive the best I can, and for everybody else, right? And I think at the end of the day, I think what we're seeing is a result of that right now.
Yeah. God, we're depressing today.
I'm
sorry.
Smoke them if you got them, folks. Smoke them if you got them.
But can we also recognize that I think there's still a lot of Americans who are striving and wanting for those things. I think perhaps what we haven't succeeded in as a society is our ability to weather the resistance to change. We know that movements for change are met with especially violent and strong backlash, right at the moment where they gain their greatest power.
Yes.
And we also know that, like, I remember, being in Paris, France at the start of the Iraq War, and I was like, these people know how to protest.
Right.
And it was not one day, it was like all the time. I think we're just not like acculturated to that in the US, the kind of persistence of resistance and how lasting it has to be, that it's not one day or even the month or 2 months that it was in Seattle, which apparently to the rest of the country was completely horrifying. We were fine. But that it needs to be sustained.
I mean, there's, people talk about the Montgomery bus boycott, right? That happened in the 60s with MLK, where like, I know they don't teach civil rights history in public school anymore. So for those who don't know, the Montgomery bus boycott was when they had segregated buses over in Montgomery, Alabama. And the community there decided like, no, we want to actually be able to ride on the buses as equals. And so I want to say that the bus boycott took I think maybe a year and a half. Like this was like people literally having to walk miles to school, miles to the grocery store, miles to a friend's house, because they didn't want to showcase they wanted to showcase the
every single day.
Yeah, every day. And also like the economic pressure, right, that put on the bus company, that eventually they had to relent. And so to your point, right, I mean, it's endurance, right, has to be the key, I think, in terms of solidarity and solidarity movements, and in terms of these protest movements. And I will say, I mean, and not to, again, I don't want to leave people with the impression that we are like cynical about this, but in all seriousness, it's like we have seen that ultimately the thing that works in getting us out of these issues is like interdependence, and the fact that we are truly in this thing together, and individuality, I'm sorry, is not going to save us.
Yes.
It just isn't.
Yeah. And like, I just want to take a moment for a huge shout out to the groups and the individuals who have held this together with endurance, right? Who have continued to do that hard work. Whether it's, the mutual aid networks or, the student demonstrators who have been, showing solidarity with Palestine for over a year now against really enormous threat, or just the folks who are still bringing community together to, figure out how to care for each other. I think there is that endurance in our spaces. It's just not always the thing that's celebrated.
Right. I think even elevated, right?
Yeah.
We were talking about this off, sort of, yesterday when we were prepping for this show, but there are so many stories, right? that could be told, right, about the mutual aid networks that continue to exist, like how communities continue to help each other, right? And even social innovations that were made during COVID, right, that people still utilize today, and like the fact that we are at a time when many people, probably justifiably so, do not think that they can depend on the federal government, and so they themselves are taking the onus on them to like provide meals for people, to provide clothing for people, to provide even just just opportunities for meaning and purpose for folks, right? That don't have anything to do with like sort of religiosity, like, and I think those are the things that hopefully obviously on this podcast we'll continue to showcase and talk about, but also those are the things that I think people need to really become aware of, because there is a different choice that people can elect to make than simply just the path that many people seem to be on right now.
Yeah. This reminds me of the first time that you and I ever talked was you were interviewing me for a story about crowdfunding and the pandemic. And I think it was also like a lot of George Floyd protests were going on at the time. And I remember that we had a bit of a conversation around this pretty weird and new phenomenon at the time of people giving small amounts of money to their Black friends. And then that ended up being kind of like
I must have missed that. I was very broke at the time and still.
Yeah, I know. Where was I?
That's so great. Did I miss the memo on this? But anyway.
But yeah, like Emmanuel Dezotzi of Reply All ended up going and doing a story about this bizarre story about just sort of people giving very small amounts of money, like coffee money, to their, like anyone they could find on their Instagram followers that was Black. And he kind of referred to it as
Bob,
like,
I know I've never spoken to you, but here's $5.
I hear you might not be white. Here's some money. But like Emmanuel goes on to describe it as like, here's $5. Sorry for racism, which is just like, it's the fact that everyday Americans could turn to that with enough mass that someone makes, a radio episode about it, but also that we all think that's kind of a normal thing to do, says so much about how I think the individualism of American society has trained us to think that like, oh, this will fix it. Like we're good now. But also this attachment to the idea of like, I'm going to do a thing and I'm going to fix it and then I'm going to walk away from it.
Yeah.
Right. Whereas like we know that movement work is this like this radical act of staying with the trouble for like a really long time.
Right. It's a battle, right, that is never ending. I remember once I don't remember, I wasn't alive at the time, but I remember reading Susan B. Anthony's quote when I think it was the 19th Amendment finally passed, giving ending women's ending women's suffrage at that time, and giving women the right to vote. And she said, "Did anything ever seem so perilous in terms of that journey?" Right? That because it started in 1776 and lasted, I want to say, at least 140 years or something like that. So for that to actually take hold, right? I mean, that was something that, again, I mean, it needed the endurance of people to continue to stick with it. Abolition, right? It needed people who were willing to sacrifice and willing to endure, willing to realize this was something that I might die before I see the end of.
Yeah.
But this is something that I need to contribute to in terms of a legacy, in terms of a communal legacy, right, of ending this.
Yeah. And I wonder if that's perhaps where some of our, kind of collective work needs to be doubling down right now, is on the things that the current administration or current legal assaults on our rights can't touch, right? And that is the space of norms, right, and ideas. And I do think that is a place where some of this has shifted. I see it in the way that like my daughter, for example, is being educated around trans rights issues, and even the fact that she very comfortably like uses a whole range of different pronouns with her friends, in a completely normal like comfortable way that would have been inconceivable even to parents of small children 10 years ago, right? And so I think there are these shifts in norms, the fact that abolition, for example, police abolition, prison abolition is a really foundational part of a lot of conversations in a lot of fields right now, in a way that was just like not even conceivable.
You're perking me up, Nora.
I'm
Okay,
trying.
Gosh darn,
I'm
I think I'm there.
I don't think it's just like crunchy granola Seattle where this is happening either. I remember back to this topic of mutual aid. I had a really fabulous student at the University of Washington during the pandemic who decided she really wanted to kind of study how mutual aid networks were coping with the pandemic across the U.S. And she had these incredible conversations with mutual aid organizers all across the U.S. And it wasn't just New York and Portland. It was like mutual aid networks in like Alabama that were having these really radical conversations with people. And it wasn't just that they were like helping people pay for groceries or get masks. It was that when someone came to them who was hungry, they said, it's so unfortunate. It's so unfair that our system has made you so precarious. Right? They're just completely shifting the narrative that we have in the US, which is so shame-filled and so individualistic about why people end up needing help. And it was, I'm so glad you're here. And I'm so sorry that our system forced you to be here.
Right.
And let's figure out what we can do.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, to your point, right? I mean, I think people are sort of waking up to the fable that has been, well, if you just work hard,
Yes.
and
like that mythology is like disappearing before our eyes.
I mean, I remember talking to grandmother, and she was like, I worked 3 jobs, so
I feel like the gig economy really killed it.
Right. Is success like I'm just still waiting for that. Is it like going to arrive tomorrow? And so, I mean, I do think there are, even when we look now, right? Even though the media, tried to, I'm a member of the media. So even though larger portions of the media, tried to make, I think, the victory of this current administration, in terms of the electoral victory of this current administration, to be more than it was, right? I mean, I think it's important for us to, identify the fact, right, that, I mean, more people voted for somebody else than voted for this current administration. I mean, they did win, right, in terms of they won like more electoral votes. But I mean, if you look at the popular vote, like razor thin margin, you look at the fact that so many people elected, to stay home. I think that at least for me, I think that showcases that there are people who are not only reachable, but need to be reached, right? And are waiting to be reached, and waiting to be reached with a message that resonates more than just, well, you're in it by yourself, right?
Yeah. I mean, because I think it's safe to say that, like, it's very safe to say that the majority of Americans feel like it is not currently working for them. And what I mean is not just like whoever's in the White House, but like our systems of healthcare, our systems of economics, our systems of supporting one another when hard times are constant. I think the vast majority of Americans would be like, yep, it's not working for me.
Right. I mean, people are starting to wise up, like none of these systems are magic. They've been put into place by human beings. It's hard, don't get me wrong, but they can be undone by human beings. And maybe that is an unfortunate silver lining of this administration, is that so much is being disrupted and dismantled. And maybe, quite frankly, some of it needs to be, right? It's, my fear is what ends up being replaced. And so I think what we have now.
Well, also possibly that they're dismantling all the wrong things.
That too. Yeah, that's, I need to do an itemized sort of check on like what is actually. But
I would like them to dismantle our tax system, for example.
That would be great. Maybe the health system and replacing it with a universal, payer or something. But anyway. Universal single payer. But anyway, that being said, I do think, right, I mean, it is showcasing that these things don't have to exist as they are if we don't want them to, right? And so if we don't have, so my thing is like, but the only way that we are, again, and not to, no, I will say like to purposely emphasize this, right? The only way that we are going to get through this and build systems that do actually benefit us and are made truly for us is together, and like is in some way like an enduring solidarity,
Mm-hmm.
right? That realizes how messy solidarity can
Yeah.
be. Like the fact is, like, sometimes I understand, like, hell, there's family members I like it's hard to be in the room with at times, right? And so I can only imagine somebody that you don't know and you're trying to organize with them. That being said, it it beats what we have now.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah. One last point, at least for me.
yeah.
I don't know how many more points you
No,
have.
no.
But I think also, part of what we're trying to do in this podcast is really navigate that strange place between the past and the future that's yet to come. And
Yeah.
on this episode that's sort of about the weird time, the length of time that we've been here.
And still are.
And still are. It's still happening. It does seem important that we also start to embrace more forms of collective memory making, right? So that like we have a better sense of what the recent past has actually been. The ways in which many of us, and myself included, have forgotten what 5 years ago right now was actually like is kind of terrifying. And so I don't know, like, what are those ways that we can build collective memory making as well in a time of like anti-facts and misinformation?
I would say, I would like layer that on with like, I think it's also a time of collective visioning, right?
Yeah.
Of like, what is it that we truly want to be and want to see and continue to tell ourselves, right? Like, I don't know what that is right now, right? Like, I whether it's this administration or previous ones, as George H.W. Bush would say, I don't know if we got the vision thing down, right? It's and I think ultimately what I've come to realize is that I think a vision for this country can't necessarily come from the top down, right? I mean, I think it does have to be the bottom up. And so what does collective myth making, if you will, for good look like right now?
Yeah.
And I think it has to be something that is truly inclusive and at the same time willing to acknowledge and celebrate difference, right?
Yeah. And like move beyond tribalism, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I don't think it's going to come from the existing sides
No.
of the establishment.
Not at all, right? I mean,
not at all.
I think in some ways, right, I think you see it in the polls, right, where both Democrat and Republicans as parties their approval rating is in the toilet, right? Because neither one has done anything that of true service, right, to the general populace. And I think people are starting to tire of the pendulum swinging back between the two. And the fact is, right, we have a system where ultimately the party that's out of power most often doesn't have to do anything to get back into power other than wait it out, right? And that system is one that just is not conducive to transformative change.
Yeah. So in that spirit, shout outs to the folks who are doing the work of imagining, right? And I mean, that's such a diverse group of people, but there's so much art and music and writing, but also I'm thinking of our friends over on the podcast 1 Million Experiments who have been literally creating and sustaining the work of trying to figure out what abolition looks like in everyday life. I mean, there are these really beautiful pieces of work that are happening all across our country to try and envision something else. Whether it's what a single payer healthcare system could look like for the US, which like we have lots of people engaging in those kinds of experiments. I think this is a call to keep tinkering with the very messy work of repair, right?
Absolutely. And I think, this is the time that I think it is prime. It is, it's a priority, right, for us to build, right, and for us to experiment, particularly at a time period when it is so hard to register, to have any progressive change, if you will. And I mean that in, small p progressive change registered at the federal level. And so what are we going to do what are we going to continue to do, I should say, at our local levels, right? And I think organizing, having conversations, like, sitting around dinner tables, trying to maybe have a resurgence, if you will, of civic life and what that
Mm-hmm.
actually means.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't have to, hopefully it isn't just about voting every 2 years or whatever, or every
Yeah.
or a year with the special elections and so forth. It's actually about like getting together, visioning what do we want our neighborhood to be? What do we want our community to be? And then, well, how do we continue to layer up from that?
Mm. That seems like a good place to segue into joy.
Yeah.
Are you have you restored some of your joy this week?
I slowly but surely, these John Mayer mixtapes, they just continue to
I'm still waiting to get
burst.
mine. I don't know what's happening.
I'll see what I can do.
Okay.
I'll see what I can do, Nora. No, I this week is actually my 44th birthday. So
Happy birthday.
thank you so much. I do not, at this age, I do not take any, I was going to say any years for granted. I don't take any days for granted
Yeah.
at this point. And so it's one of those things where, like, even with all that is going on in the world that is not so great, it's being able to still find joy and hope and love, in that time period. And I've been blessed with so much this last year. So
Marking time. Yeah.
Yeah.
I like that. And I hope you have a very, very happy birthday.
Thank you.
Full of lots of love and celebration.
I plan to. Hopefully, I'll remember this year's unlike last. But anyway,
John Mayer might be making an appearance. I don't know.
Definitely the cover band.
Yeah. Okay.
Let's see.
It's your friend John Mayer here to play a special little song for you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
Now, what about you, though, Nora? What is giving you what have you been able to find in terms of joy this last week?
Mine is really nerdy.
Okay.
Are you ready?
I am prepared, waiting with bated breath.
Okay. So for those who don't live proximate to ocean, like we have the privilege of doing
Yes.
here in the Pacific Northwest, it is the season of low tides, where visiting low tidal zones and exploring all the weird creatures that live there
Oh my
is
goodness.
really, really awesome. And I have always loved, tide pools and tidal
Yes.
creatures and just the wild array of ecological species that you can see in a tiny little place. Whether it's like sea anemones or like sea slugs. Some of these creatures are like these like microscopic, cool, neon little water dragon type things called Nudibranchs. And but anyways, the reason I'm talking is mostly because I was reflecting this week on how much that is a space of living in the meanwhile between tides, and
Yeah.
how resilient and tuned to the necessary resilience all of those creatures are. And it just made me think a lot about cycles. And, these are sea-dwelling creatures that in the middle of summer suddenly are like sunbathing for like 12 hours a day, and seeming to thrive while doing so. So I hope as we turn towards the summer months that maybe some more of us can figure out how to thrive in the meanwhile in the tidal zone as well.
I am also hopeful and optimistic.
Okay.
And I am glad that it's tide season. It's also hurricane season, apparently, that the FEMA chief did not know that. So
God. Yeah.
we'll send him
We're going to send him a briefing.
Yes. Let him know. So.
A couple bullet points on what's going on.
Gosh, if we could only bring back DEI so we can get some qualified folks in these positions. But anyway. No, but that's, in all seriousness, that is awesome. I might just go tiding myself.
I feel like I need to take you out to go poke at some weird squishy sea creatures.
Yeah. I will put that on my summer list to do. Okay. So I'm adding it to it. Awesome. All right. Awesome. Well, with that, I will go ahead and will read us out.
Awesome.
Thank you all for listening. We know that you have a ton of choices when it comes to podcasts, but you're listening to this one, and we thank you for doing so. New episodes drop every Friday. There'll be one next Friday. In fact, you can follow us on social media on Blue Sky, Instagram, Threads, and YouTube. We want to shout out to our producer, Jessica Partnow, for holding it down always. Also, special shout out to Aham Aluo for our show's opening and closing music. And with that, we'll catch you in the meanwhile.